And joining us now in studio is foreign policy and national security consultant and senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, Michael Pregent. And also with us is former commander at the Tel Nof Air Force Base and former combat pilot at the Israeli Air Force, Brigadier General in Reserves Israel Relik Shafir. Thank you to both of you for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
I'd like to start with you, Michael. We're hearing these reports of a holdup of an American arms shipment to Israel. Do you believe this is true? What is the U.S. trying to signal here?
Well, it's the Biden administration that's trying to signal a pause to what Israel's doing in Rafah. I believe it came after Israel notified the Biden administration that there was going to be an offensive in Rafah. It was the same time the administration announced this holdup. However, there is a lot of pushback in the U.S. Congress on Democrats that support Israel as well as Republicans to release this. You cannot use this kind of leverage on an ally that's facing a terrorist organization. So I do expect the Biden administration to release those precision-guided munitions, such as the JDAM, 500-pound bomb that's precise, that targets Hamas firing positions. When I say firing positions, missiles and rockets. So that's a key munition to ensure that the target is hit without causing collateral damage that kills civilians.
Now, it's highly doubtful that Israel is doing any of this limited Rafah operation without coordination with the Americans. It appears they've given the okay for this limited operation to go after Hamas terrorists and infrastructure, and we've already seen that tunnel shafts have been found and other such infrastructure. So what is Israel expected to do? To just leave Hamas be? They have 4 battalions which are still living and operating within Rafah.
You know, what the Biden administration fails to remember is that Hamas killed 30 Americans, 30 dual citizens, took American hostages. If that was al-Qaeda or ISIS, we would have decimated the terrorist organization. We need to support Israel in dismantling what Hamas has put in place in Rafah and Gaza. And I've been speaking to members of elite military units here in Israel over the last 10 days, and these tunnel networks and the way Hamas fights, it's meant to create casualties. And for the Biden administration to say, or to echo or parrot these complaints that Israel is blocking aid to Palestinians, it's Hamas that is firing at the crossing points. It's Hamas that is keeping humanitarian aid from getting to the Palestinians. It's Hamas that at gunpoint is keeping Palestinian civilians from moving to those humanitarian corridors. So Hamas wants casualties, and everything that I've seen with the targeting process, the IDF is trying to limit every potential casualty it can while Hamas is trying to increase that.
Now, you're a military guy. You've spent many years in the American military.
Right.
How would the American military handle this conflict right now?
The American military would do what we call a cordon and search, which is what the Israelis are doing, surrounding a city block and going in and trying to find the terrorists. What the Israelis are doing different than how we do it is we used a proxy force during the ISIS campaign. We used Shia militias tied to Iran, and we provided air support. So if you look at the ISIS campaign in Iraq, we killed 10 civilians for every ISIS fighter in one case. We killed 60 civilians for every ISIS fighter in the last stronghold in the old city of Mosul, Iraq, where I served in uniform. When I was in uniform, we patrolled that narrow, densely populated area of Iraq. And if you drop a 500-pound bomb in that area, you're going to level half a city block based on the shoddy construction inside of Iraq. So the IDF is handling this with their own soldiers. They're putting their own soldiers at risk. And when I talk to elite units, they say that they'll go in and they'll see Hamas terrorists hiding behind women and children, knowing that the IDF, is not going to shoot women and children. And then the IDF suffers injuries, right? They get killed or shot. Hamas knows the IDF will not target women and children intentionally. That's why they hide behind them. That's why they use the voices of, the recorded voices of hostages to bait Israeli soldiers into the tunnel complex and into buildings. And I saw this building it just blew up, right? The whole building went away. And I asked the IDF soldier there, I said, was that an airstrike? He goes, no, that was a controlled demolition. And I said, you need to say that, because a Christiane Amanpour from CNN is going to say, look, the Israelis just blew up a building, killing a bunch of civilians, when in fact, that building was blown up because Hamas is using it. That building was blown up because it's already been cleared of civilians. They have found multiple tunnel entrances, multiple hatches, weapons caches. And the reason they detonate it is because Hamas will come back up through the tunnels, they'll rewire it to explode. They'll bait the IDF in using the recorded voices of hostages. You think about what that does to a soldier. You want to run in the building just like a fireman would, right? When you hear somebody calling for help,
absolutely,
you want to run in the building. So that's what Hamas is doing. They're playing on the emotions of the IDF soldiers that are putting themselves at risk, and they're putting their own civilians in front of them when they fire at the IDF. And that's what Americans need to know. Israel's ratio, combat ratio, insurgent to civilian is 1-to-1 to 1-to-2. The U.S. ISIS campaign that I served in, and in the Iraq War as well, there were 300,000 Iraqis killed during the ISIS campaign for no more than 15,000 ISIS fighters. That is a huge civilian to combatant ratio. There were no protests in the streets. There were no protests on our universities. Israel is being held to a standard, an unbelievable standard, an unachievable standard, to not kill anyone. And how do you do that when Hamas intentionally launches from civilian areas and intentionally hides behind women and children? That's the difference. That's the difference.
The impossible task that Israel is expected to perform.
Right.
Israel, please tell us about this confined, limited operation in Rafah. What makes this limited? How is it different than what they intended to do in a larger scale operation?
Well, let me commend Michael for putting forward such a vivid explanation of what the war is like. There's only one thing that I would like to note. It's not the Biden administration, it's the U.S. Mm-hmm. It's as if we would say it's Netanyahu administration, it's not Israel.
Right.
That is...
Which some people do. A lot of people like to blame Netanyahu. If anything goes wrong, it's Netanyahu.
That is quite true. Except that Biden's contender didn't offer anything better than what we're seeing now. Mm-hmm. So there's really not much hope for Netanyahu's ideology beyond the first Tuesday in November. Mm-hmm. And this is what we have to contend with. This is the game. It's a different game than in Mosul. In Mosul, none of the combatants were underground.
Right.
They didn't prepare underground shelters and tunnels for 15 years. So it's a different ball game. That's one thing. Now we're into Rafah with about 1 million people in a very enclosed space. Some of those people will not move away for reasons that you've just mentioned, but that is the reality. All the televisions of the world are concentrated in that area and very sensitive to civilian casualties. That is the reality of the situation. And we're not trying to, without saying right or wrong, but that is something we have to deal with. So how do you deal with that? A smaller scale operation, precision operation in certain areas, move away as much as you can with a lot of patience. And once you're able to go for those tunnels, use smaller munitions, not the 500,000 or 2,000 pound JDAM that we saw before on the show, but use smaller munitions from UAVs that are precise and hit anybody who's seen with a weapon, and that way take tunnel by tunnel. Then you can withdraw, go to the next one, move the people away patiently. It's a painstaking job, and be below the threshold that will cause a collateral damage, which would be unacceptable on television when the world is looking at it. It's like a bite the bullet type operation that we have to stand. And one more thing, we don't know, at least in the public, where the hostages are. Mm-hmm. There may be a situation where some of them or most of them are not in Gaza anymore. We don't know that. So do you
believe there's a situation where they've been smuggled out of Gaza?
Sure.
And into Egypt?
Yeah.
And from Egypt elsewhere?
Yep.
Possibly.
There's no reason not to think so. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, they wouldn't be. Let's say if it was us, we would probably do this. So they're savvy and they've had a lot of time to plan this. So I'm pretty sure that some of the hostages are not in Gaza anymore.
Wow.
So we have to take all this into consideration be very careful in the way we operate. One of the things that we should do, and we're not doing, is create an alternative to Hamas in Gaza. And this we're not doing for internal political reasons that where the extreme right are pressing on Netanyahu not to do so because of the repercussions in the West Bank. And this is what puts us in a dire situation with our connections to the U.S. and the Europeans.
You're speaking of a plan for the day after the war in Gaza.
It's not the day after, it's tomorrow morning.
It's right
yesterday
now.
morning.
It's yesterday. You're right, absolutely. And so at the moment, it seems like with Hamas putting a different draft on the table for this ceasefire and hostage release deal, it appears that things are not going well. It doesn't look like a very optimistic scenario.
It's a Middle Eastern bazaar. And when you're striking a deal, one of the tricks is to put on a new contract that has nothing to do with the old contract, and you got to deal with this, the back and forth. Like you were buying in Istanbul something, the seller doesn't mean the price. When he puts the price down, he doesn't mean that you pay the price. You don't need to pay that price, but the game is there. And this is the game they play, except
and that's what Hamas is doing right now.
In the eyes of the world. This is what we're doing, and this is what they're doing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Michael, any last comments?
Yeah, if I could just say one thing. Hamas needs, the most powerful narrative Hamas is using right now is that Israel is starving the Palestinian people, that Israel is trying to use aid as a weapon. It's Hamas that's shooting, that is closing those humanitarian corridors. Hamas needs to leave that, keep that narrative alive with the media in order to get international pressure, in order for it to increase on Israel. So it's Hamas that is keeping humanitarian aid from the Palestinian people. And the media needs to pay attention to that. There were 11 strikes yesterday on that crossing, and they were all committed by Hamas. And the international community needs to know that.
International pressure, there certainly is. Thank you very much, Michael Pregent and Relik Shafir. Thank you.